Here's a number that is actually worth sitting with. In a country of a few 100 million people, government will make millions of distinct decisions every single year on subjects like budgets, regulations, rulings, deployments. The single instrument that the public actually uses to steer all of this is one mark on one piece of paper, choosing between two or three names once every few years. That gap between the staggering complexity of what's being decided and the tiny amount of information that is actually used to decide it isn't a flaw that somebody forgot to fix. It's the central design constraint of every democracy that has fundamentally ever existed. See the gap clearly, and something strange actually happens. Nearly everything people complain about, broken promises, short termism, charisma beating competence, stops looking like a list of separate problems. It all starts to look like the same problem wearing 10 different masks. Folks, this video isn't a video about why politicians are bad. It's actually a video about the machine itself, and let's take it down together one by one. For once, strip away the sentiment and really think about what a vote is. Vote is a message, and every message has a property engineers care about: bandwidth, how much information it can actually carry. In the elections that decide the most power, you're picking one name from a short list in information terms. That's maybe a couple of bits, maybe three. Now compare that to the actual job. A modern government doesn't make one decision, it makes thousands and thousands of decisions every single day during its tenure and in office on subjects like tax policy, healthcare rules, trade deals, environmental standards, military deployments, and on almost none of this did your 2 year or 2 bit or 3 bit vote say anything specific that stated a clear mandate for the office to actually work on. So the winner has to invent a mandate, stretching one low resolution approval signal across an entire governing agenda, as if the vote for them was a vote for all 200 of their positions that they are trying to demonstrate during their term in the office. It almost certainly wasn't. You probably disagreed with a third of their platform, but your vote doesn't register disagreement in the first place. It registers as one undifferentiated yes. This is the first hidden mechanism. Democracy doesn't transmit a detailed instruction set. It transmits a single low bandwidth approval signal and then asks the winner to reverse engineer from that one signal what an entire country wants to do for 1,000 different questions and 1,000 different issues. Now, you might assume that the fix to this problem is something that is absolutely obvious, which is ask more questions to politicians, right? And you need to be doing this more often, and you need to be having more voices on ground. And when you have more voices and more people actually talking about this, you create essentially a bandwidth, and fundamentally, you're making small steps and progressions towards solving that problem. But in 1951, economist Kenneth Arrow proved something stranger, part of a body of work that later won him a Nobel Prize. Even with the perfect information, there is no possible voting system that reliably produces a coherent will of people once there are two or three options that are actually available on the table. Now, the simplest version, let's say there are three voters, three candidates. Voter 1 ranks them A, B, C. Voter 2 ranks them B, C, A. Voter 3 ranks them C, A, B. Check the majority preference pair by pair, right? Linking it by pairs. 2 of 3 prefer A over B. 2 of 3 prefer B over C. Logic says that the group should prefer A over C. Check it. 2 of 3 actually prefer C over A. A beats B, B beats C, and C beats A. No contradiction in any individual. Each voter is perfectly rational. The contradiction actually appears only when you merge them into one group preference. It cycles. There's no stable winner, only whosoever benefits from the order the choices happened to be presented in. The will of the people isn't always a real thing waiting to be measured. Sometimes there is no signal to send, no matter how wide the pipe. If the system can't reliably read detailed preferences, you may ask, how does anyone get to choose them at all, or how do they get chosen at all? mostly through a shortcut. Let me explain. Signaling, and it's actually worth understanding why this isn't a flaw in voters but a rational response to a measurement problem. You cannot directly observe whether someone would be a competent administrator. That's the most invisible thing that you can actually judge them before they hold a job. What you can actually observe cheaply is confidence, fluency, composure under pressure. Economists call this substitutional signaling. When a quality is expensive to verify directly, people rely on a cheaper, correlated stand in. It's why a diploma matters to employers more than specific things someone learned. A costly, hard to fake proxy for discipline and intelligence, even though it directly measures job performance. Elections actually run on the same substitution. Competence is what voters want. Composure is what they can actually see. So, composure becomes the proxy, and like any proxy in the world, it can be optimized directly, coached, and rehearsed without the underlying thing improving at all. It's less about people are shallow and more about judging a surgeon by their handshake, because the operating room has no windows for people to actually see how good of a surgeon the doctor actually is. Push the signaling problem one step further and you observe something that is even more fascinating, right? Democracy is structurally a hiring process that interviews for one job and assigns the winner with a different one or a completely different mandate. The skills that win elections are simplified messaging, emotional resonance, making a hard trade off sound very easy in front of the public, and they aren't strongly correlated with the skills that governing actually requires them to do. Tolerating ambiguity, right? Delivering bad news, sticking with slow technical progresses for years. They can coexist. They very often actually don't. So, something unique happens in nearly every modern democracy. Elected officials govern less directly over time, delegating more to people nobody voted for, like central bankers, you've got regulators, courts, career civil servants who are run the actual machinery, who are the brain behind actual machinery, bureaucrats in the case of India. Usually not a power grab, right? It is an adaptation. The elected layer increasingly provides legitimacy and direction. The unelected layer, what they do is they absorb the complexity no campaign optimized skill set was actually built to handle, which raises a question most civic classes actually skip. If the people making the most detailed decisions were never on the ballot, what exactly is the vote actually controlling? Mostly the direction and the consent, not detail. You're not hiring an operator, you're hiring a face who can go on to legitimize a vast machine that the face cannot fully understand, right? If that makes sense. A different axis of the same architecture, not choosing people but evaluating what they do. Imagine two actions costing the same. Build a brand new bridge, ribbon and cameras included, or reinforce 20 existing bridges so none of them ever collapse. The first produces a visible, attributable outcome. The second one actually produces nothing. No event, no story, just an absence of disaster. Nobody can prove the spending cut actually caused. You can't film a catastrophe that didn't happen. This is the verification asymmetry. People can only reward what they can actually perceive, and prevented disasters are invisible by definition, and it's so true in the system that most people actually neglect it altogether. And I'm not saying it's their fault, right? A government that quietly prevents crisis for years fundamentally gets no credit, which means they don't have any credibility for them to get re-elected and run to office for the second time. A government that responds dramatically to a crisis, even with the one better planning could have actually avoided, gets celebrated for its decisiveness. And the more we go on to reward this award, the more we go on to reward this actual behavior, the more we see this behavior unfolding across countries and offices. Greek mythology has a name for this related curse that we are actually talking about. It's actually called Cassandra, gifted with true prophecy and cursed so nobody actually believes her warnings until it is too late. Politically, the curse is structural, not personal. Preparedness budgets get quietly cut the moment the emergency that justified them fades from the memory until the next one actually arrives and the cycle resets. The electorate isn't undervaluing invisible work, it structurally, fundamentally cannot see it in the first place. Layer the last two machines together, and something sharper emerges. Elections were never meant to be the goal, they were meant to be the measurement, a periodic check on whether the governance is actually doing well and the people who are elected in office are keeping up to the promises that they had actually promised they would fulfill once they got into office. But a principle from statistics, which is called the Goodhart's law, applies with precision here, right? And it says something very interesting, and I reiterate it says, once a measure becomes the target, it stops reliably measuring the thing that it was actually built to track. What an irony. Standardized tests meant to measure learning become things school teach directly to. Sales targets meant to measure value delivered become things employees game directly. Elections meant to measure governance quality become something political actors learn to optimize. Not the governance itself, but its appearance and timing. Economists call the documented pattern the political business cycle. Governments scheduling popular spending and good news as close to elections as legally possible, and painful but necessary decisions for right after when accountability is safely preserved for years. This requires no unusual cynicism, right? Only that the measurement rewards timing as much as it actually rewards substance, and people learn to optimize what's actually rewarded, and that is the loop that the politicians are stuck in, and that is the loop that we start respecting as citizens. Compress something as complex as, is this a country governed well, into one periodic yes or no signal, and you don't just lose information with regards to what is actually going on, you manufacture an incentive to fake the signal that is actually coming out of you, and you later go on to justify it saying that you're taking sides of the right and left, where fundamentally these kind of stances do not exist in the first place. Every mechanism so far has involved people who are able to vote. Here's the one that doesn't. Democracy can only represent people who currently exist and are currently eligible to vote. Another very important development, right? It cannot give a vote to someone who doesn't exist yet, and it cannot fully give one to someone who exists but hasn't turned 18. The second part isn't about strangers who aren't born yet, it's about you specifically. There were years, your entire childhood, where decisions about debt, infrastructure, and resources were being made permanently in your name while you held no vote, no veto. Whenever you inherit that particular power, you inherited and you had a say to say a yes or a no. Here's the scale of what gets decided during that silence. Global government debt is on pace to pass the size of the entire world economy within the next few years, right? A line the planet hasn't crossed since 1948 in the ruble of a world war. This time there's no war, there's no major war per se, at least, just decades of decisions made by people who couldn't vote, paid for by people who for years legally couldn't. 2 centuries ago, the phrase for being taxed without a voice was taxation without representation. Rotate the same structure out of the geography and into the perfect time, and it never got its own name, but it produces the identical injustice on a longer clock, and it's already happening to everyone who's already watching this. Before they were old enough to notice, the future doesn't lose this negotiation because they're cruel. It loses because the only people who actually come to office every single time by definition are the only people who are currently allowed to, and for the first 18 years of life that excludes you as well. Most people are thought to fear one particular failure mode above all of the others, right? The tyranny of the majority, 51% trampling the other 49. Constitutions are built specifically to guard against it. But look at how policy actually gets made, and a near opposition pattern shows up consistently. Call it the trinatracy or the intense minority. Economist Mancure Ulskan laid out the mechanism. Organizing a group to persuade a political goal is costly, time, coordination, and it requires some repeated efforts. These costs are easy to bear when a group is small and each member actually has a lot of stake, and expensive when a group is huge and each member only has limited stake to actually make a difference. A policy that costs 10,000 people $1 each to deliver $10 million to 10 people tends to sail through. Not because those 10 people are unusually powerful, but because organizing 10 highly motivated people is cheap and organizing 10,000 mildly annoying people is relatively expensive in today's day and age. Most of the 10,000 people have never ever learned it. happen, right? And multiply that across thousands of small decisions year after year, and you get something that looks special interest winning. But the deeper mechanism is just the mathematics of collective actions. Concentrated stakes will always out organize the diffused ones, and that is something that we have to acknowledge even before we start fighting for it. One more layer and a genuinely counterintuitive pattern actually appears. Established democracy tend to get dramatically better at stopping things over time and worst at actually building them. The reason is almost arithmetic. Every added check, a court that can review, an agency that must sign off, a hearing that must be held, is by design a new veto point. Veto points exist for good reasons. They make it harder for one single actor to actually ran through some catastrophic policy. That's the whole ideology of why a veto power exists in the first place. But they have actually become an asymmetric side effect. To block a project, you need only one veto point to say no, right? To build one, you need every veto power to say yes. As a system adds more check over the decades, and democracies always add more, since removing is a safeguard in its fundamental meaning itself, and it goes on to become political risk. The odds that something gets blocked rise, while the odds everything aligns to approve it fall immensely, right? Switches wired in series, not parallel, add more, and the chance to circuit completely drops fast, even if each switch works fine on its own. We didn't design democracy to be slow, we designed it to be hard to actually fool. Every safeguard against being fooled is also one more place to get permanently stuck. Look back at everything that we have actually covered, and the pattern is hard to unsee. The bundled low bandwidth vote, the mathematically impossibility of one coherent will of people, confidence substituting for competence, the quiet handoff to unelect technocrats, invisible prevention, the political business cycle, the unprecedented future, organized minorities outmaneuvering the indifferent majority, the asymmetry between blocking and building, nine consequences of one underlying fact. Democracy is at its core a method for comprehending an almost incomprehensible large amount of human preferences into a comparatively tiny stream of unusable signal, and then governing a complex civilization using that compressed signal as mere input. That reframing changes the question worth asking. Is democracy good or bad? Isn't even useful at this point, right? It's a coin flip that is actually dressed as a debate. Every alternative human have tried. They've tried autocracy, technocracy, oligarchy, one rule party. They go on to solve the compression problem differently, usually by deleting most of the input signal rather than improving how it's processed. They don't escape the underlying problem that we are all trying to discuss here, right? They fail more quietly when no feedback loop left to catch, and it pushes the whole country or the civilization towards catastrophe, and nobody has a say. The more interesting question almost nobody asks now is that the mechanism actually has a name, and can it be engineered around? It's already stated in experiments most people have never heard of. Ireland convinced random selected citizens' assemblies, not elected, sampled like a scientific poll, given weeks to study an issue in depth to break deadlocks elected politicians had avoided for probably a generation. A small religion of Belgium runs a standing citizens' council alongside its elected parliament. Researchers have actually spent decades contradicting the voting, right? Which lets people express not just which option that they actually prefer or how strongly they actually prefer that particular option, a dimension of bandwidth in a single mark, which should not allow an entire government to carry that as an input signal. None of these are proven cures, right? And each could create new failure models of its own. But they share something. They treat democracy not as a finished monument to defeat or tear down, but as a piece of technology mid development with an identifiable bottleneck. We've spent a long time arguing about whether democracy is good. The more useful question might be something that is actually simpler. What's the next version, and what would it take to widen that signal that we are all talking about so excessively?